For nearly 1,700 years, one man's name became another word for betrayal. Say Judas, and people think of greed, of shame, of the kiss that sealed Jesus' fate, of the disciple who sold out the Son of God for silver. His name has become so loaded that it almost sounds like a curse. But what if the story we were told was only part of the truth? What if the most hated man in the Bible was not just a villain? What if he was actually part of a secret that changed everything? And what if, in one shocking ancient text, Jesus did something no church lesson ever prepares you for? He laughed. Not once, not by accident. He laughed at the disciples while they prayed. That is where this story begins. In 2006, a strange ancient manuscript called the Gospel of Judas was introduced to the world after disappearing for centuries. It had passed through the black market. It had nearly been destroyed. It had even spent years locked away in a bank vault in Hicksville, New York, slowly falling apart. Then the world heard about it, and the argument began. Was Judas a traitor? Was he a hero? Was he deceived, or was he the only disciple who truly understood what Jesus wanted? This is not just a story about a lost book. It is a story about betrayal, hidden knowledge, power, religion, and one of the most disturbing questions ever asked about faith. What if the person we call evil was actually the one carrying out the plan?
Our story does not begin in a church. It begins in the Egyptian desert. Somewhere in Middle Egypt in the 1970s, a farmer came across something buried in a cave. It was not treasure in the normal sense. It was not gold or jewelry or a king's tomb. It was a leather-bound ancient book made of papyrus. He did not know that what he had found was about 1,700 years old. He did not know that this fragile old codex would become one of the most controversial religious texts ever discovered. At first, the manuscript did not go to scholars. It did not go to a museum. It did not go into careful hands where it could be protected. It went into the underground world of artifact trading. For years, it moved through the hands of dealers and collectors. It was bought, sold, hidden, and resold again. And along the way, it suffered. The pages cracked, the ink faded, the binding decayed. This was not just history sitting still. This was history being damaged in real time. Then came one of the strangest parts of the story. At some point in the 1980s, the manuscript ended up in a safe deposit box in Hicksville, New York. Not in Cairo, not in Rome, not in a university archive, in a bank vault in suburban New York. For 16 years, this ancient book sat there while it slowly broke down. The pages got worse. The manuscript became more fragile. What could have been studied carefully was instead left to rot. By the time experts finally got it, the text was already in danger. In 2000, a Swiss antiquities dealer named Frieda Chakos Nussberger bought the codex. She understood that this was not ordinary material. This was not just an old relic. This could be one of the most important Christian manuscripts ever found. Then, in 2004, she made a decision that pushed the story into the global spotlight. She sold the translation and publication rights to National Geographic. That deal changed everything. In April 2006, just before Palm Sunday, the world was told that the Gospel of Judas had been translated. Newspapers, television stations, websites, and commentators all rushed to react. Some people called it a discovery that could shake Christianity. Some called it a fraud. Some said it would destroy the Bible. Others said it would finally reveal the truth. The Vatican responded quickly. Pope Benedict XVI condemned the text as heretical and insisted that Judas had betrayed Jesus out of greed, not obedience. And right there, the fight began. Because the real question was not whether the manuscript existed. The real question was this: what did it actually say? And wait, it gets crazier. Because once you understand the text, you realize this was never just about an old manuscript. It was about a version of Christianity that made the official story look much less stable than people wanted to admit.
To understand the Gospel of Judas, you cannot read it like a modern Christian devotional. You have to enter a very different world. This is where most people get lost, because they hear words like Gnostic, demiurge, and pleroma, and their minds switch off. So let us keep it simple. The Gospel of Judas comes from a Gnostic way of thinking, and Judas in this text is not just a bad man making a bad choice. He is a man who thinks he is helping Jesus escape something bigger. He thinks he is breaking Jesus out of a cosmic prison. That is the core idea. Not just betrayal, not just politics, a cosmic rescue. In the Gnostic view, the world we live in is not the final or highest reality. It is flawed, broken, confusing, heavy, a place where spirit is trapped in matter. The material world, in this view, is not the true home of the soul. The true God is beyond all this, beyond flesh, beyond pain, beyond the physical universe. But the world we live in, according to Gnostic thinking, was made by a lower power, a lesser creator, the demiurge, who is not the highest God, but a kind of false ruler over matter. That image matters, because when people hear lesser God, they may picture something abstract, but Gnostic writers often imagined something far stranger, darker, and more twisted. A lion-headed serpent, a being that looks powerful but wrong, a ruler that seems divine on the outside but deeply flawed underneath. That is the visual language of the myth. Now bring Judas into it. In the Gospel of Judas, the shocking idea is that Judas may have understood something the other disciples did not. While the others are still acting like normal disciples, praying and learning and trying to follow Jesus the usual way, Judas is given secret knowledge. And then comes the part people never forget. Jesus laughs at the disciples. Why? Because in this text, the disciples are praying to the wrong power. They think they're worshiping the true God, but Jesus sees them as trapped in confusion. They are blind to the deeper truth. They do not understand the system they are inside. That laugh is the clue. It tells you this is not a normal gospel story. This is a story where the world itself is the trap, and Jesus is not just teaching morality. He is revealing hidden truth. And Judas, strangely enough, is the one who may finally get it. That is why this text is so explosive. Because if Judas understood Jesus differently from the rest, then the whole betrayal story changes. He is no longer just the man who sold Jesus out. He becomes the man who may have thought he was helping Jesus complete his mission. And that one shift changes the whole game. In the traditional Gospels, Judas Iscariot is the worst of the 12. He steals, he betrays, he kisses Jesus to identify him, he hands him over. He is remembered as the man who chose money over loyalty. That is the version everyone knows. But in the Gospel of Judas, the story turns sharply. The text does not begin with Judas betrayed Jesus. It begins like a secret message, a revelation, a private conversation. That matters, because this is not presented as a crime report. It is presented as hidden knowledge. Jesus speaks to Judas in a way that sets him apart from the others. And at one point, Jesus tells Judas something extraordinary, that he will exceed the others, and that he will sacrifice the man that clothes him. That sentence is the heart of the controversy. On the surface, it sounds shocking, but in Gnostic language, the meaning is different. The body is like clothing. The real self is spirit. So when Jesus speaks about the man that clothes him, the idea is that the physical body is only a covering. It is not the real Jesus. It is the garment around the divine being inside. In this reading, Judas is not being asked to murder the true Christ. He is being asked to help remove the outer shell. That changes everything. Now, Judas is not simply a traitor in a political story. He is a participant in a spiritual escape plan. He is the one willing to do the terrible thing that will free Jesus from the prison of flesh. That is why some readers saw him as a hero, not because he did something pleasant, not because he was morally clean, but because, in this version of the story, he may have done the one thing everyone else was too blind to do. He understood, and once he understood, he acted. That is the danger of the Gospel of Judas. It does not just rewrite Judas, it rewrites the meaning of the whole betrayal. Here is where the story gets even more interesting. When National Geographic released its translation, it presented Judas in a positive light. The public message was clear. This ancient text showed Judas in a new way. That was the headline version. But then the argument got messy. A scholar named April DeConnick pushed back hard. She said the translation may not be as clean as people were told. She argued that some important phrases were being read too generously. And this is where the story stops being just a translation debate and starts feeling like a mystery. Because now the question is not only, what does the text say? The question becomes, did the scholars reading it fall into the trap the text itself set for them? That is the double conspiracy. First, there is the ancient text. Second, there is the modern reading of the text. And if both can be manipulated, then the truth becomes harder to pin down. That is a far more exciting story than maybe someone mistranslated a line. The plot thickens. Some scholars believe the National Geographic team fell for a 2,000-year-old trap. In other words, the Gospel of Judas may itself be built in a way that makes readers think one thing while meaning another. That turns the whole debate into a whodunit. Was Judas a hero? Was Judas a demon? Was he chosen? Was he tricked? Was Jesus speaking honestly, or was he playing a deeper game? This is why the debate matters. Because if the text was designed to hide its meaning, then the argument over translation is not a side note. It is part of the story. And that makes the manuscript even more dangerous. The reason the Gospel of Judas caused such a storm is simple. It challenged the official story, not just about Judas, but about Jesus, salvation, authority, and the way early Christianity saw the world. If the text is read in one way, Judas becomes the only disciple brave enough to understand Jesus. If it is read another way, Judas is still cursed, only now he is cursed in a more complicated way. Either way, The text is not friendly to the traditional Christian picture. And that is exactly why it mattered. Because the early church did not only fight over beliefs in the abstract, it fought over which stories would survive, which books counted, which voices were allowed to speak, which version of Jesus would become official. The Gospel of Judas was dangerous because it offered a different Jesus, not a weaker Jesus, not an unimportant Jesus, a Jesus who spoke in secrets, laughed at rituals, and seemed to see the world in a way the mainstream church could not accept. That kind of text was not just unusual, it was threatening.
Now we get to the deeper issue. Even if Judas understood Jesus differently, we still have to ask a hard question. Did Judas really have a choice? That question is bigger than the Gospel of Judas. It reaches into the New Testament itself. Because even in the canonical Gospels, Judas is not written as a free and simple actor moving through the story without pressure. Something strange is always happening around him. In Luke, Satan enters Judas. In John, Jesus speaks of one of the disciples as a devil before the betrayal is complete. Judas is named as doomed before the full act even plays out. So the real puzzle is this. If God knew Judas would betray Jesus before it happened, if the betrayal was part of a plan, if Judas was pushed, possessed, predicted, or even required, then how much blame belongs to him? That is not a small question. It is one of the oldest and hardest questions in religion. Because if everything was already known, then what exactly was Judas choosing? And if he had no real choice, then why is he the one who gets all the blame? This is where the story becomes painful. Because now Judas is not just a sinner, he is possibly a trapped man. A man inside a system bigger than himself. A man caught between prophecy and responsibility. And once you see that, the story changes again. Now we need to take the idea of predestination and make it plain. Forget the long theological label for a moment. Think of it like a court case. If God is the judge, the jury, and the scriptwriter, then Judas was not a criminal, he was a prop. That is the real pressure point in the story. Because if the ending was already written, then Judas did not step into history freely. He was placed there, set there, written there. That is what makes this so unsettling. Not just that Judas was predicted, not just that Judas was known, but that Judas may have been built into the story from the start. That is the cosmic setup. A human being is created. A human being is born. A human being is made to play a role in a divine plan. Then that same human being is judged for doing the role he was given. That is not a small moral problem. That is the center of the argument. This is where Christians have wrestled for centuries. Some theologians argued that God knows everything before it happens. That means Judas's betrayal was never a surprise. Others went further and said God did not merely know it, God ordained it. If that is true, then Judas was part of a plan from the beginning. That sounds powerful at first, but it also creates a moral problem. Because if God created Judas knowing exactly what Judas would do, and if God used Judas to bring about the crucifixion, then Judas was never fully free in the first place. He was set up, he was shaped, he was assigned a role in a cosmic drama and then judged for playing it.
That sounds less like justice and more like a setup. That is the tension that gives the story its force, because once you see that idea clearly, you cannot unsee it. A human being is born. A human being is watched. A human being is used. A human being is condemned. And the audience is expected to call that righteousness. That is why the cosmic setup feels so heavy. It takes the mystery out of Judas and turns it into a question about fairness, maybe the harshest question of all.
Now, let us return to the Gnostic world, because the visuals matter here. When the Gospel of Judas and other Gnostic ideas talk about the highest realm, they are not imagining a soft heaven with clouds and harps. They are imagining something more intense. This is the pleroma, the fullness, the place beyond the broken world. It is not dark, it is not muddy, it is not trapped. It is pure light, pure knowledge, pure being. That is why the contrast matters so much. Below that realm is the broken material world. Above it is the blinding order of divine fullness. And somewhere in between is humanity, caught in the middle. The world was either broken matter or divine fullness, prison or release, confusion or knowledge. That is the battlefield Judas is walking into in this story. And once you see the world that way, Judas no longer looks like a random thief. He looks like a man standing in the middle of a cosmic war. By the time the early church was becoming more organized, it needed order. It needed unity. It needed a clear message. The problem was that the earliest Christian world was not simple. There were different groups, different interpretations, different ideas about Jesus, salvation, the body, the soul, and the afterlife. The Gnostics were one of the biggest problems. Why? Because they changed the whole framework. They said the physical world was deeply broken. They said secret knowledge mattered more than public teaching. They said the material body was a trap. And in some of their texts, they even suggested that the God of this world was not the highest God at all. That was too much for the church to absorb, because if those ideas spread, then the church's authority would be weaker. So the church pushed back. Texts like the Gospel of Judas were rejected, excluded, attacked, and in some cases, forgotten for centuries. That is why the disappearance of this text matters. It was not just lost in a random way. It was pushed to the margins by the winners of the theological struggle. History is often written by the side that survives, and the orthodox side survived. But wait, it gets crazier, because the very act of erasing the text made it more powerful once it came back. So, what does all this mean if you strip away the academic language? It means the Gospel of Judas is not just asking, was Judas bad? It is asking, what if the story was deeper than we were told? What if the man we blame was actually part of a larger plan? What if Jesus and Judas had a private understanding the others did not have? What if betrayal was really a kind of rescue? What if the worst act in the story was also, in another reading, the one act that made the story possible? That is why the text keeps people arguing, because no matter how you read it, it refuses to stay simple. It forces you to sit with contradiction. It makes you wonder whether the truth was hidden on purpose. And that is exactly the kind of question that keeps people watching. At this point, most people focus only on Judas. But the deeper issue is not just him, it is us. Because most people do not just want a Bible story, they want a clean answer, a simple villain, a simple hero,
a simple good guy and bad guy version of history. The Gospel of Judas does not give that to us. It says the world is more complicated, maybe too complicated, and that is uncomfortable. Because once you admit that one biblical story can have two very different meanings, then you have to admit something else. Maybe many of the things we think we know are not as settled as we were taught. Maybe not every story has only one layer. Maybe not every religious tradition gives you the full picture. Maybe some things were simplified for you long before you were old enough to ask questions. That is where the real sting is, not just in Judas, in certainty itself. This is not only an ancient argument, it still matters now. People still wrestle with free will. People still wonder why bad things happen if God is good. People still ask whether destiny is real or whether life is just choice after choice. And people still struggle with the gap between what they were taught and what they now suspect. That is why this story connects. Not because it is a dusty old manuscript, not because it belongs to scholars only. It connects because every person has had a moment where they asked, "Wait, is that really the whole story?" That is the feeling this text taps into. It is the feeling that maybe the version you heard first was only the version that won. And once that idea enters your mind, it is hard to leave. Now, let us bring this closer to home. This is not just about a lost book. It is about the lost parts of your own faith. What have you been told to believe that you have never actually questioned? What story did you accept because it came from authority, not because you examined it? What part of your thinking has been shaped by fear instead of truth? What part of your spiritual life is built on assumptions you never tested? That is the personal side of the Gospel of Judas. It pushes you to ask whether you have your own Judas inside your thinking. Not a traitor, not in the moral sense, but the part of you that keeps carrying something you were never fully allowed to question. Maybe it is a belief. Maybe it is guilt. Maybe it is a family story. Maybe it is a religious fear. Maybe it is the way you were taught to see yourself. Whatever it is, the question is the same. Have you ever really examined it, or have you just inherited it? So here is the final challenge. If Judas was a villain, then the story is simple. He betrayed Jesus, he got what he deserved. End of story. But if Judas was a hero, then everything becomes harder. Because now he is not just the man who failed Jesus, he is the man who understood Jesus, the man who agreed to carry out a terrible task, the man who may have helped free Jesus from the prison of flesh, the man who may have chosen to be hated so that a greater plan could move forward. That does not make the story easier, it makes it stranger. And maybe that is the point. Because the Gospel of Judas does not ask for easy belief. It asks for honest thought. It asks you to look again. It asks you to stop repeating the same story just because it is familiar. And it asks one question that is much harder than all the rest. If you had to choose, was Judas a hero or a villain? And before you answer too quickly, ask yourself this. What if the story you learned was only the version that survived? What if the truth was always more complicated? What if the man everyone hated was the one who understood the most? The Gospel of Judas does not hand you a neat conclusion. It leaves you with a choice. Not just about Judas, about how you think, about what you accept, about whether you are willing to question the story you were given. And maybe that is why this ancient text still feels alive. because it does not just ask what happened to Judas, it asks what happened to your ability to question.